I guess we could start, if that's okay. Yep. Yep, good. Okay, so hello. I'd like to welcome you to this panel session on ethics and AI. I'm Marina Girotka, and I'm Professor of Human-Centered Computing here at the Department of Computer Science at Oxford University, and I'm going to be chairing this panel. In the next hour, we hope to discuss some of the ethical issues surrounding the development and use of AI in society. So, what we're going to do, the kind of structure of the panel session, will be we'll start by discussing some of the critical questions that have been raised in the field, and I'm going to intersperse those questions with questions from you, the audience, and questions from the social media. So, on the panel today, we have Dr. Maria Rosaria Taddeo from the Oxford Internet Institute. We have Dr. Paul Dafoe from... Alan Dafoe, sorry, Alan Dafoe. I was focusing on the Dafoe, and then I missed Dr. Alan Dafoe from the Future of Humanities Institute, and Dr. Paula Boddington from the Department of Computer Science as well at Oxford. They're going to introduce themselves in a little more detail shortly. The panel itself seems very timely because there's now a whole set of debates about ethical and social implications of technology in general. Whilst we're actually now in the middle of one such controversy that I'm sure you can't have missed, and while it's not yet clear exactly how that's going to play out or which technologies were involved, it's quite likely that at least machine learning was involved in them. These recent exposures are occurring against a backdrop of concerns raised in relation to AI. We've seen concerns about professional work being radically transformed by those technologies, and anxieties have emerged regarding their implications on society. And this, of course, was the topic of the previous panel at this expo. But other concerns have been raised as to how much control over decision-making such AI systems should have. And are there areas that we should actually limit for the scope of AI systems? And as seen again this last week, what are some of the particular dangers that actually might emerge from automated decision-making systems? And can we actually even control them now? So for me personally, these issues are interesting not only from an academic background, but also from my background from a while ago. My first research position was on an ALVI project. Some of you may not know, some of you may not remember, but in the 80s, the government heavily funded a range of projects, including artificial intelligence and intelligent knowledge-based systems. And at that time, there was a context of countries, particularly the Japanese, developing what they called fifth generation AI, and it was felt that the UK should really be doing something competitive as well. The government then funded some very large integrated projects on decision making related to particular organisations. So at that time there was a great amount of debate about the role of AI in society. So for example, there was a lot of discussion about whether we could and should automate medical decisions and diagnosis in what were then called expert systems, or whether we should and could codify the whole of the legal system. And all of this was against the backdrop that AI and computing in general would transform whole areas of society and different types of work. There was a claim, for example, that middle managers would disappear, and quite prominent people were claiming that we would all have to start living in what was called the leisure society. It's interesting that these concerns are being echoed in current debates. But what's different now is that the technology seems to be much closer and have much more impact on society, communications, and individuals. And the rhythm of innovation has quickened. We're all interacting already, daily, with these types of systems on the roads, in our domestic lives, and at work. And many of these products are being driven by industry, independent of academic research. And this context I find particularly interesting in relation to the processes through which we might innovate responsibly. Since those early days of AI, I've been working in a field researching into how systems can fit with people, how they work and collaborate. And my research group is now concerned with informing the design and development of new technologies to be much more responsive to societal acceptability and desirability. So over the last few years, my research has been concerned with something called responsible research and innovation, developing approaches and frameworks for a range of technologies, of which one is AI. A key part of responsible innovation is about trying to anticipate both positive and negative outcomes of innovations and drawing on those to influence the development of research and technology as a creative resource. So that's a bit about me. I'd like now to ask the members of the panel to introduce themselves and to give a little background to their interests. And at the end of their introductions, I'd like to ask each panel member to conclude their talks by outlining what they consider to be the most pressing or challenging ethical issues for AI systems to address. So perhaps we could start with Maria Rosaria.
Of course, thanks. I work at Oxford, at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I am the Deputy Director of the Digital Ethics Lab, which is a research group working on problems focusing on the governance of digital technologies. I'm also a research fellow at the University of Oxford and a fellow at the Turing Institute, which is the Data Science Institute in the UK, soon to be renamed the Data Science and AI Institute in the UK. As a background, I'm a philosopher and an ethicist. I started my career working on philosophy of AI, asking questions such as, can AI attach autonomously meaning to the symbols? The answer is not, so no semantic there. I've worked on trust among artificial agents for security, and these days I work a lot on issues such as privacy, transparency, still trust, but also interstate cyber conflicts, how cyber measures, cyber capabilities can impact international stability. I've been working with NATO to define guidelines for the aggressive use of cyber capabilities within the international arena, and more these days on how to deploy deterrence strategies based on AI in cyberspace. So this is pretty much the bigger general picture. I won't say too much about myself. It's not that interesting, and there is a website. I might focus a bit more on the challenges that I see about AI. And I'm a philosopher, and as a philosopher, the thing that I do every time I am asked to work or think about something is provide a definition. Definitions are the building blocks for me. And AI is defined in very different ways, and you get that wrong, ethical analysis become very close to sci-fi, and then they become irresponsibly distracting from crucial issues that we have to face. So let me give you a definition of AI, which is based on what we used to call AI when, from the Dartmouth moment when AI was started to take place. It's a counterfactual definition. So for me, or for people working on AI, AI is a resource of interactive, autonomous, self-learning artificial agent, which we use to carry on, deliver tasks, which will be delivered otherwise with the use of human intelligence and intervention. That's AI. That's what I will refer to when I think or talk about AI in the next hour or so. So the challenges. Well, one challenge is certainly data governance. AI is fueled by data, and so we need to make sure that transparency, privacy, and trust are properly addressed when we think about AI. But then there is a whole nexus of problems that emerge from the autonomous nature of these agents, which are much more complex to face and address. So the first one I wanted to refer to is delegation. We delegate a lot to AI, a lot of decisions, a lot of actions. And the delegation sometimes become very, very hardcore, if you wish. So we remove the human being from in the loop, from on the loop, and from post the loop. And this is actually a risky process. We should make sure that there is a way of maintaining human oversight and monitoring, at least for redressing when we deploy AI. The second thing I wanted to mention is this deresponsabilization. It's this idea that whenever a machine is involved, we can blame the machine. And this happens if you think about Europe proposing to give some kind of civil rights or citizen right to AI. This is not the right way of going, because responsibility is a big issue, and the answer, more than blaming the machine, is understanding how we have to reshape responsibility and the concept of responsibility to make it applicable to the case of AI. Previous panel talked about the loss of jobs and the impact of AI on the work market, on the workspace, and I think that's a big question as well that we have to face, which has two issues that we have to focus on. One is the de-skilling. The more we delegate, the more we make AI becoming not just a tool, not a colleague, but someone or something in the team, the more it's likely that human beings are going to be losing their skills in doing things. And this is also quite risky, especially in safety-driven context. We want human beings to be able to still diagnose, to still read X-rays, to still read CT scan and understand when there is a problem. We want a human being to be able to land a plane and not just rely solely on the AI, because that might fail. They might make a mistake. They might not work. Two more challenges, and then I'll try to be brief. So one is the erosion of human freedom. We've seen in these days, no? So AI can nudge us into doing things. into pushing and pulling, so until our behavior is changed. And that poses under sharp devaluative pressure our autonomy and our dignity. We have to make sure that that doesn't happen, to at least to extreme consequences. And finally, there is misuse. The father of this field of research, the field in which I work, computer ethics, Robert Wiener, wrote a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, and that's what it is. So we have to make sure that we use AI in an ethical way, and we have to make sure that we avoid unethical deployment, unethical design, unethical implementation of these technologies as much as we can. I'll tell you one word about the solution. The solution has the same source than the problems. It's human beings. It's us. We have to design the technology in a better way, we have to understand how to regulate it, and we have to understand how to use it for the best and for the good of societies. There is no other place where the solution can come from.
Thank you. That's very good. If you hold your questions then, I hope that's been quite stimulating already. I'd like to go to Alan now. Perhaps
Great.
you would like to introduce
you.
yourself.
So I'm a political scientist who up until recently studied primarily world order and world peace. AI, I think, is very important for that, as I will soon explain. I'm also a researcher of statistical methods, in particular for social science, so that provides a bit of context for my relationship with machine learning. For those of us who take a macro-historical perspective on technological transformations, we often give the name of a revolution to them. So there's the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, nuclear revolution. I think the artificial intelligence revolution will be on the same magnitude as these over the coming decades. That clearly is a tall order for us in terms of the attention we need to pay to them. My work is with the Governance of AI program at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, as well as at Yale, and as well with colleagues from a variety of universities, Stanford, Berkeley, Cambridge, other private sector groups in AI labs such as DeepMind, OpenAI, Google Brain, and others, and governmental bodies and IGOs. Before I begin enumerating some governance challenges and ethics challenges, let me first be clear, the potential benefits from AI are tremendous. In medicine and health, energy and the environment, education, poverty alleviation, business, and of course economic growth, we can imagine a very large potential upside. The challenge is to make sure we maximize the upside and minimize the potential downsides. One way of thinking about how AI will work is to recognize that it's a general purpose technology, similar to processes such as the industrialization, electrification, the combustion engine. These are processes and technologies that transform the economy, politics, social relations in a very often disruptive way. So far, we've done well by these processes, but nevertheless, it's plausible that we can manage them better in the ones that are coming into the future. So let me concisely enumerate 9 governance challenges, some of which have been covered. It will be incredibly concise, and I would be happy to discuss any following. So first, as have been discussed, is the application of AI to consequential decisions. This can be regarding loans, parole, employment, medicine, social media, and so forth. As we do that, we need to be attentive to how our values, justice, fairness, democracy, privacy, are being respected and realized or not in those domains. 2, AI will be deployed in safety-critical systems, also as we've discussed, self-driving cars, energy systems, cyber defenses. We actually have a recent report on this, which you can find by Googling maliciousAIreport.com. Now let us consider some more extreme governance challenges that may be upon us in 5 to 10 years just from existing AI today. This is from 2018 AI. 3, as also mentioned, AI could massively displace labor and dramatically increase inequality. 4, AI could shift market structure towards natural global monopolies, which would make the logic of international trade much more rivalrous, giving states incentives to form large economic blocs and support their AI champions. With many of these, I'm saying could as an academic, but we can already see these dynamics at work. 5, AI will enable governments to develop powerful tools of surveillance and domestic control, which could be used in various ways. 6, as hasn't been mentioned as much so far, AI could increase strategic instability. This is a sort of term of art for the risk of inadvertent nuclear war. Just to give a bit of color to this, because probably many of you haven't heard of this, AI is doing several things. 1, it's enabling sensor technology, processing subsea sensors through autonomous drones and integrating, say, real-time satellite imagery to allow a great power to form a real-time image of the nuclear force posture of another country. And two, as we start automating kinetic conflict and cyber conflict, the dynamics of escalation could become much more quick, much more rapid, and unpredictable. And that poses important risks. 7, AI will now enable powerful military developments which could shift key strategic parameters from the balance of power, the volatility of power, the observability of power, and elasticity of power. Okay, so that's a lot of governance challenges, but that all presumes that AI basically is as it is today, 2018, and it just continues to be rolled out and deployed into the economy and other systems. But AI is not standing still. So far, we haven't seen any signs of a coming AI winter. So this leads us to our 8th challenge, which is to anticipate what might be coming in 5-10 years technically. This is a very difficult technical problem, but it's something that we can't afford not to engage in. We can then start thinking through the ethical and governance challenges of what might be technically possible. And 9, and finally, is the challenge of the AI race. So firms and countries are increasingly engaging in a sort of race dynamic with each other and a competitive dynamic where there's strong incentives to be the leader in some industry or in some capability. This, in general, in our systems is a productive force, but it can be dangerous when there's externalities in economic lingo for some danger that may hurt all of us that's not internalized by actors. Plausibly, there's large global externalities with AI. If you just think, as we start deploying these powerful, opaque, complex systems in our financial market, transportation systems, safety critical systems, energy systems, and so forth, it's important that we have a good sense of how they work, ways in which they can be fragile and they might break. So that's a lot of work to do. We're working on many of these governance challenges, and my hope for this conversation is that we will encourage others to join us, be that researchers, firms, governmental bodies, and others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Paula.
Thank you. So, like Maria Rosaria, I'm also a philosopher by background, although I've spent most of my career involved in interdisciplinary work of various sorts. So I've been working in the Department of Computer Science here since 2015, and earlier on that year, the Future of Life Institute announced a grants program for projects looking around how to develop beneficial AI with funding from Elon Musk and the Open Philanthropy Project. And Professor Mike Wooldridge of the Computer Science Department, who you'll have met this morning, and Professor Peter Millikan of the university's philosophy faculty, and I applied for a grant and were successful, lucky enough to be among the recipients. So our project has been exploring how you might go about developing codes of ethics in artificial intelligence. So our concern in this was not so much to actually develop codes of ethics, because for one thing, those should be something which is done by a really large number of different sorts of people. It's not up for experts to tell other people how the code should go. But what we wanted to do was look at some of the background issues about how you might go about doing this and how you might start thinking about the ethics. And in particular, one of the things we thought we could do in a project was that, because I've done a lot of work previously in medical ethics, for example, and also looking at ethical issues in developments of medical technology, and in particular genomics technology. There's an awful lot of hype about AI, as you'll be well aware, and there's an awful lot of hype about ethical issues in AI, and a lot of people constantly are saying, these issues are completely new, we've never faced anything like this before. There are very few things which are completely new. So one of the things we wanted to do was to avoid reinventing the wheel and looking at what we might be able to learn from how codes of ethics and regulations have been developed in other areas. And actually, medicine is a very good example to follow, because it's one of the professions where there have been pretty well worked out regulations and laws which have developed over the last, getting on for a century, but certainly since the Second World War. So it was a good model to follow. And there are many parallels, also disparallels with AI. And another thing as well that we wanted to look at was how people are talking about ethics in AI. So likewise, a lot of the issues which we're looking at in AI, which raise ethical issues, look as if they're very new, but actually they're extremely old. So if you've been to the talks this morning, you will have seen there are issues about how we might have very abstract goals and rules, and how those might be implemented into AI to produce concrete, real, beneficial action. But the debates about what's the link between really abstract notions and concrete reality is a debate which ancient Greek philosophers, for example, were having almost 2,500 years ago with, I'll probably get shot by somebody from a philosophy faculty by making this so simple, but with roughly Plato on the idea of looking at the abstract. He talked about an abstract notion of a form of a good, and his pupil Aristotle coming along and saying, hang on a second, not so fast, we've got to try to get the form of a good realised in concrete action. So these are really similar debates that we're having now in AI. So we can draw on this centuries of thought and thinking. But on the other hand, there are some issues concerning AI which are particularly troubling, and the other speakers have already touched on these. So that there are ones which need particular attention, and which particularly mean that standard approaches to, for example, developing professional codes of ethics are going to be particularly difficult and just might not work, or we might need new ways of thinking about it. So one of those is precisely the notion of autonomy and control, because it's a guiding principle behind, say, professional codes of ethics. There's a guiding assumption that the professionals know what they're doing and they can control their products and services. And also in terms of ethics, that they can explain why they've done something, that they're held accountable. But there are elements of AI which make that problematic. Issues about the autonomy and issues about the lack of transparency that's present in some AI. So, on the other hand, it's precisely those aspects of AI which give us very, very good reason for thinking very carefully about the ethics. So it needs really, really broad-ranging thought. And that's another reason why it needs to involve as many different people as possible. We need to think about it really, really widely and consider really carefully what the implications are. Especially as well, I think, because one of the things which a lot of AI does, or it has potential to do, is to really push our values to the limit. So, for example, work is an example of that. If it's really the case that many people will simply be out of work, or even if it's the case that we'll manage to prevent actual unemployment but reduce the amount of work that we're doing, or if we greatly change the nature of work, we have to ask questions about what do we consider valuable? Why do we consider work valuable? What's valuable about work? What aspects of work do we really want to get rid of? What do we want to keep? Those are really central questions, which actually, again, philosophers and other thinkers and theologians have been asking for centuries and centuries. So we can draw on that lasting wisdom, I think, and think about how it might apply to what's going on today. And lastly, just one thing I want to say about ethics, and it's a professional hazard that as soon as you start talking about ethics and regulation, people think that you're trying to stop things. But ethics is not simply about banning things or stopping people from doing things. As other people have said, AI has got potential, great potential for good, if used wisely. So that ethics is really all about trying to make sure that we develop AI in a way that's going to be beneficial for humanity. So if I could turn to the question of what the major challenges are, I'd agree with the previous speakers about, I think all of the things that have been mentioned are really important challenges. And if I could perhaps summarise what I think some of the major worries are. AI concerns, it's technology which concerns how we decide things and how we think. And we also need to see how AI is operating, and I know there are questions about exactly how you define it, how AI is operating nested in other technology. So there's been huge changes in how we use technology in regard to computing. Not all of it is AI, but AI is embedded in that. And AI can greatly increase the power and the scope of what we do. So it can greatly increase the power and the scope of manipulating data, for instance. So you can get something which was a small problem now becomes an enormous problem. So one of the questions we need to ask with AI is, just because we can do something really quickly and really efficiently, should we be doing it at all? So, for example, you might think, well, on the one hand, it's very efficient that we can dig up Australia very, very fast using mechanical robots. But as somebody who's got dual UK-Australian citizenship, there are actually quite a lot of heated issues about whether or not we should be doing this as fast as we possibly could. That's just one small example. But again, thinking about the question about how AI affects our thinking and current issues with regard to social media, for instance, and current issues about how we're getting our information and how we're communicating, and how things might be, say for example, turned into fake news, or how things might be manipulated. AI is producing problems which AI can't solve. So problems about, for example, technological unemployment, that's got to be solved by thinking about how we might have other interventions or social solutions to this. So one possible solution to that, which many people are mooting, is, for example, the notion of universal basic income. So universal basic income is going to have to be administered by a state, by governments. It's a huge political question which involves thinking about what's going to happen to this, how's the money going to be distributed. They're huge political questions. Likewise, the question about how humans are interacting with data and what we're getting, how our information is being filtered through, for example, the internet, and through part of that being through AI. That's potentially ways of controlling populations, controlling what we're thinking in ways which is not too far away from being really, well, it is actually really, really concerning. So another sort of possible issue, how people can be surveyed and how they can be monitored. These are all issues which are really currently in the news at the moment. So the ways in which AI raises issues which AI itself can't solve, which are social and political issues, the way in which those issues actually concern about how human beings are thinking and actually participating in society and participating in political debate and political thinking, they're all conspiring to create what could be a really horrible, muddy soup, if I can put it like that. And so that's not a very good way of putting it, but I think I hope you know what I mean. So these issues interact with each other, and they're embedded in other issues. They're embedded in political, social, cultural, and economic issues. So untangling them and making certain that we're thinking clearly into the future, I'd put that as my biggest concern about AI.
Thank you very much. We've got some overlaps and we've got some differences. I'd just like to throw it out now to the audience if you have any questions in response to anything that you've heard so far. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Connor from the FT. I was interested in what you were saying about how data challenges aren't necessarily new, in the sense that there have been other sectors, like the medical sector, where
Yes.
we've had to create kind of codes of ethical conduct and regulations. And I just wondered if there are any examples that are particularly pertinent of previous waves of regulation and consideration of ethics that might apply to what we're thinking about now with AI.
Well, in terms of, there are codes of ethics in the engineering profession, for instance, which is perhaps a little bit closer to AI than medicine. But one of the things we also need to think about is that, say, in the regulation of medicine, it hasn't simply been that there have been developed codes of ethics and laws. One of the things that's happened is that there's been widespread scrutiny of medicine by interested parties, by patient groups, for instance, and also by people from within the profession who are critical of the profession. So that's actually been fairly well developed socially. And that's something that we need, that is developing, but we need to develop very much in AI, that we need to have widespread scrutiny, which means we need to have widespread public education, understanding of what's going on, and get lots of different voices in. So that's one of the things that's happened in medicine, which I think we need to develop and think about very much in AI. So it's not codes of ethics and regulations as per se. But there's one. So I'd also like to think about one area of, which is an area of difference, but also an area of overlap in a way. So that in medicine, when you're developing codes of ethics for professions, say, there's a general background idea that what the professions are doing is basically good, and but they've got to try to produce benefit and not to produce harm. So that's one of the central principles in medical ethics, isn't it? First of all, do no harm. And of course, there's going to be a bit of harm, because as soon as you do surgery, for instance, there's some harm. It's got to be balanced. But that's harm or benefit in relation to the accepted goal of health. AI is much more general than that. So it applies to everything. So that means it's going to be much more difficult to think about. And because the knock-on effects of what's happening in AI are much more complex and difficult to track, that's one big difference. But there are also similarities, because if you look at a lot of the hard issues in medical ethics, they are about what exactly do we mean by health, and is health always an absolute goal? So there are occasions when chasing health at all costs isn't what we should be doing. And
Could we ask Maria
Maria Rosario
Yes,
also,
yes,
she's
yes,
kind of
yes,
itching
yes,
to get
yes,
in
yes,
here to answer that
yes.
question as well.
Just before we flatten AI ethics or medical ethics, it's a very interesting question. And I think she has a point when she said that we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. But it's an approach that works in some areas, not in other areas. Some questions are radically new. For the very simple reason that we never had autonomous artificial agents before. That change is a big, big game changer. So that means that we have to ask ourselves fundamental questions. Are these agents morally responsible, for example? Who's morally responsible? Does the concept of moral responsibility that we have apply to their deployment? We have started to delegate actions to these agents. Delegation usually comes with trust. Do we trust artificial agents? Trust is a moral concept. Does that mean that we invest these agents of some other kind of features that they might not have? Think about cyber conflicts. We're waging conflicts for the first time ever without causing physical violence. When you go and regulate this kind of conflict, the absence of physical violence changes a lot the scenario. So some questions are really new, and we have to make sure that we address them as new questions. So looking back is important, but we have not to be kind of hold back. And the other thing is that the good governance of AI is based and is shaped on ethics. But ethics means just understanding the values of our societies. So there is a risk of keeping looking back, that is the missing out of what we want our societies today and tomorrow to be. So there has to be a kind of much more wider horizon. So yes, there are some places in which we can use what we already have. For example, I'm thinking about data philanthropy. So this idea that we can donate data. There are codes that museums, that philanthropical association use, that might be inspiring in this context. We don't have to go and write the whole thing up again. But the bigger picture requires much more deep insights.
Alan, do you have anything to add to that?
Very briefly, I thought that was very helpful, the comments made so far. The addition I'll make is to say, to the extent that AI is a general purpose technology like industrialization, electrification, combustion engine, or others, try using that as an analogy for ethics. What would be the code of ethics for an engineer developing better electricity production and distribution? And you quickly see this knock-on dynamic, that most of the consequences of electricity didn't happen from the first order effect. There were some first order effects, but most of them are second, third, fourth order. So really the ethical question ultimately has to be one that we ask as a society and that we use encompassing institutions to solve.
Okay, does that address your question? I think that's quite interesting again, because it's bringing up the context. The context is so important. So whilst we do need to look back, there are some new questions, because these things emerge with the new technologies. And sometimes it's very hard to anticipate what they might be, because they emerge through use in society. And so we always have to be agile, I think, about what we're doing there. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to take a question from social media, and that question is quite sort of related to how some of the challenges that you brought up at the beginning. So the question comes from Charles Lyman, and he says, I appreciate the concern over the long-term implications of sentient AI, but I'm much more worried about the short-term control of AI by malevolent humans. Would the panel like to comment on this?
Yes.
So,
I'm very much on the same page of this comment. There are pressing issues that we need to face. And these issues go from, are we still exerting our democratic values in our societies, to are we biasing crucial decisions in such a way that minorities are going to be on the difficult side of the divide. And these questions are important because they shape societies as they are. Questions about general AI, superintelligence, singularity, machines coming killing us, they are distracting, irresponsibly distracting questions. They hinge on two things, which I would like to stress. As students in logic, there is something which is called the ex falso quadruped. So whenever you do an implication, if, then, if the premise, if, is false, whatever can follow, and the implication still works. It's a logical rule. If, in this case. So if at some point machines will be super intelligent, they're going to kill us. It's all that if. It's not sure. Might be logically possible. Technologically speaking, it's unfeasible, as we learned this morning. And if you don't want to buy the logic argument, there is a more substantial argument, perhaps, which is that When we think about superintelligence, we misunderstand what is that can be computable. We're talking about intuition, intentions, gut feeling, emotions. These things are not computable. The father of AI, Turing, he said that asking the question, can a machine think, was a question that was not worth thinking about. That's not the right question. So I'm afraid that this comment is very much on the right side. Let's not get distracted. We're developing technologies which is impactful, powerful, can take society to become a much better place. Let's make sure that we steer that way and we don't get distracted by sci-fi claims.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything?
Absolutely. I think I agree more than superficially. It seems like we do agree with Maria Rosaria.
Yeah.
Let me
Just the
expand.
name that makes you proud.
So first of all, I'll do another plug for our recent report. MaliciousAIReport.com is exactly on this topic. We look at we begin reminding the reader that yes, AI has tremendous potential benefits, but here are all the sort of Black Mirror or sci-fi scary scenarios in the next 2 years or 5 years. These are not Terminator robots, though they might be drones or micro drones. Okay. So yes, this is a real challenge. I think misuse is a challenge. Crime is a challenge. Terrorism is a challenge. There's many challenges, though, that are not easily just blamed on an individual. So inadvertent nuclear war is not, it doesn't fit well in the framework of misuse or malicious actor behavior. It's a byproduct of a dangerous dynamic between two actors. And so there's lots of these kinds of byproduct risks that can emerge. Again, or you can think about like the flash crash deploying algorithms in the stock market. It wasn't necessarily that any one actor was at fault, though you might want to structure the legal system so some are, but rather there are these emergent risks that the government and institutions fail to internalize and address. So there's a whole host of those risks that we're going to face. However, as AI scales in capability and power, there are real challenges of understanding how they work, of controlling systems in the sort of socially optimal way, and in what's called value alignment. And this is a term, or it's sort of a research target for researchers in what's called AI safety. And these are researchers who worry that it's actually very difficult to specify values and ethics and what a single individual actually wants from a machine. Right? If you literally say what you want, you likely misspecify, or you almost certainly misspecify your true goals. And the problem is machines are sort of literal creatures. Either if you program them using good old-fashioned AI, or if you train them using machine learning, they learn, what their sort of reward function asks them to learn, and potentially nothing more. So they might have sort of a fragile understanding of what your goals are, and that could go seriously awry. So there's real research going on this, and as I mentioned, actually top labs are working on this. DeepMind, OpenAI, Berkeley, and elsewhere at FHI are working on the question of, as machines get increasingly powerful, how do we make sure that they are in conversation with the sort of human owner and user, and correctly understanding what the human wants and understanding human preferences. And it's a really exciting field of research going on. Okay, but I'm saying as capabilities scale, but how far could capabilities scale to? And what's often an attractor concept is human-level AI, or sometimes called AGI, artificial general intelligence. Now, we don't know if this concept is a natural kind, right? We have no empirical basis to say, as artificial intelligence develops, does it kind of go towards this one notional construct of human level, or it could evolve in all kinds of ways. So intelligence is a multidimensional concept. It's sort of, you can think of it as ability to solve problems, and the problem space is very high dimensional. Okay, so it's a complicated concept, and I'll try to wrap it up soon. Machines are better than us already at lots of tasks. A calculator can do faster arithmetic and more reliable arithmetic than humans, but they're also grossly incompetent at other tasks, most clearly represented by common sense questions. Right? You can ask machines, AlphaGo, for example, or AlphaZero, trained itself to play Go and chess in less than a day better than any human, with no human level input, with no human guidance or textbooks. And yet, if you asked either of those, some question outside of the scope of the domain, they had no ability to answer. However, we do know there's at least one instance of intelligence that's capable of this thing we're gesturing at called common sense, general reasoning, and that is human intelligence. Right? We have this ability to solve problems in new domains, learn from single observations, and so forth. So it's plausible that at some point machines will be as good as humans at many senses in which we talk about that common sense or generality. Now the question is, when is that? If it's 2100 or 2500, then it's science fiction. We can push this off a little bit. Maybe a tiny subset of us science fiction writers can think about it. However, if it's 2030 to 2050, then even though it's still decades away, we ought to be, some of us, thinking about what that means, what its implications are. Now, it's very hard to forecast the future of AI, but I can at least share when we ask AI experts when they think human-level machine intelligence will be achieved, defined in a very high way as machines is better than all humans at all tasks. The answers, one, are widely dispersed. So some will say 2100 is sort of their median prediction, and some will say 10 years. But there's enough probability mass in the next 10 to 20 years, say around 10% in 10 years and 25% in 20 years, that we think it warrants greater attention to the possibility. Now, I just want to make one last point, which is the idea that this is rivalrous. Thinking about AGI and risks from AGI is rivalrous with near-term issues. I actually don't think it is. Many of the solutions to near-term issues are relevant to long-term issues, and vice versa, thinking about transparency, scalable control, alignment, learning from human preferences. Also, just as a matter of fact, the people who are interested in supporting long-term risks are often very different funders than those who support near-term risks. So I just, as a matter of fact, don't think there's a conflict here. I think it would be like climate change researchers arguing with sort of weather disaster researchers over the rivalrous of funding for their respective enterprises. They're on the same page. They both want to understand the system and for the betterment of humanity.
Thank you. I think Maria Azari just wants to respond to that.
Sorry. I have to. I must. So is this point, logical plausibility is such, is plausible. It's not a contradiction. It's not a merit bachelor. There is a possible world among the infinite possible world in which this thing can develop. It's unfeasible. And yes, we can say that people working on superintelligence might not be working to the detriment of all of us working on real, concrete, pressing issues on AI. But let's say that I can go to the Sainsbury's on Covent by an helicopter or by my bicycle. I get there. I just wasted a lot of more money, resources, and means, and disproportionate strategic approach to focus on something which I could have done by investing all the resources on the specific concrete issues. It's something there is no evidence for, and scientifically it's very hard to think that because it's just logically plausible, then it's something that deserves attention. Because a lot of things are logically plausible but remain unfeasible, such as singularity. So that's my point with it.
I don't know if Paula wants to say something, and then Alan, you can come back.
Well, I wasn't going to get involved in that particular
It's
row.
quite crowded, but you
I'm
can
on
join.
your side.
Okay, Alan, do you have anything you want to say in response to that?
Well, I'm sure we could go on
Yeah.
with this for a while, and I'm sure it's of interest. If you're an insurer of a casino, there's several ways you can get insurance. One is based on frequentist statistics. You can say, what's the probability that the roulette wheel goes against me so many times? And you can form a distribution of your risks. And if you just do that, just based on empirics, you will not correctly estimate your risks. And this was true of a famous casino where their headline attraction involved a lion and a lion tamer, and there was an incident in which the lion was not sufficiently tamed, and that cost that casino far more than any of its predictable losses. So in practice, we have to be Bayesians about the world. We have to form subjective beliefs about various risks that we face. Some of these risks occur more frequently, and so we can rely on data, and others we have to rely more on theory. When AGI comes is one of those things that we can't rely on data for, because we don't have a sample to draw from. So we have to draw on theories of intelligence, theories of progress in technology and economics and so forth, perhaps models of forecasting and forecasting accuracy. This is all research that we can do. We can also rely on expert judgment. And through a variety of these approaches, I can say there are sound reasons and experts who study AI and who are at the frontier of AI who believe we are making rapid progress towards AGI and that timelines of 10 to 20 years are not unreasonable. Now, Maria Rosaria makes the good point that it really depends on the risk. If it's 1% or maybe 0.1%, perhaps we don't want to invest in it, whereas if it's 5% or 10%, that seems pretty striking. Currently, the actual investment in AGI risks is tiny in the world relative to the investments in AI or in a variety of other issues. And so I think society can afford some modest investment in the potential surprises. I will also say, to conclude, in sort of technological forecasting in history, there are many instances where the researchers at the front completely failed to foresee what was coming. And so perhaps the most striking example is that atomic bombs were not foreseen by virtually any serious thinker as late as 7 years before Hiroshima. So 7 years before Hiroshima, most nuclear physicists, most political leaders, most military decision makers had no clue that there was going to be a bomb that would transform international politics.
It might be worth to read the biography of Enrico Fermi about that. But yeah, so I got lost on the lack of data because that's when science stops, at least for me. There are experts who have testified in front of Parliament here that AGI is not being developed in any meaningful sense. And this is important to keep in mind. The other thing is that we want to try to mimic stuff like intelligence, intuition, intentions, consciousness, about which neuroscientists, scientists working on this all over the world have the least clear clue ever. So yeah, it's not about the risks, it's about what science should focus on, which is the real world and stuff which is supported by data and evidence, which I don't see. Okay,
can we sort of agree to disagree there? I think you've seen some of the differences. And thank you, Charles, for that question from social media.
Paula, did you have... I wanted to say one little thing about the end part of the question about malevolent AI, because we need to think about what actually malevolence is and what sorts of things lead to really bad or even evil consequences. And sometimes it's from somebody starting out as like cackling evil person intending evil, but very often what happens is that we're slipping into something very bad incrementally. So I always like to refer back to the classic Milgram obedience to authority experiments, which probably a lot of people here will know. Classic experiments which he actually did because he was trying to work out what led people to behave so atrociously in the Second World War. And he asked people to, thinking that they were giving electric shocks to a learner, and actually it was fake. But most people carried on giving electric shocks past the danger level. And how he did it was by getting them to increase the voltage tiny, tiny, tiny bit at a time. And something else which I think about a lot in relation to how AI might come into our lives is it says a lot about notions of control. So that this was something which I think Milgram himself, in his discussions about it, it was the technological apparatus, the fact that it's in a lab, the level of authority, that people just carried on obeying. He just kept saying the experiment must continue, and it continued. That was all it took for the majority of people to do this. So one of the things we need to really think about with AI is, are we giving it too much control over our lives? Are we just incrementally letting things take over human decision-making? So that's I think, a really big danger for how we might slide into malevolence.
So leading into the next question then is, how do we, as designers and developers then, decide what those responsibilities are and try to avoid those sorts of consequences or unintended consequences? I don't know if Maria Rosaria, would you like to?
I'll go first.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it's a big one. I think that we have to think about the design of AI as something that, precisely because of what Paola was saying, the deep and the pervasive use of AI in our society and its ability to shape habits and things. So, there is this quote that we added in a paper published in Science last month from Winston Churchill. It said, well, we design buildings, and then we shape buildings, and then buildings shape us. And so we design AI, and then we use AI. By using AI, AI shape us. So we have to make sure that this interaction is something which is coherent, consistent, to use another logical word, with our values, with the values of our societies. So part of it changes depending on the cultural context, but some values are at core: human dignity, autonomy, ability to foster and flourish as human beings and as societies. These are crucial. Going back to the example of AI in the workplace and displacing jobs and changing the economic balances of our societies, for example. But it's clear that leading this change and not being led by this change means not only think about retraining and this sort of thing, but also understanding how do we share the cost and the benefit of this change among all the actors in our societies so that we can lever inequalities, but also among current and future generation, because future generation are going to most likely to support less of the cost and get most of the benefits. How do we plan these things? So I think that, to give like a catchphrase, it's about designing the regulation and the use of AI, thinking not just about, with a foresight, thinking not just about today or yesterday, but about tomorrow, or as it were, next week. Because the responsibility that we have today now is not just regulating, it's shaping, designing societies as well as technologies.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll give a hopefully brief technical answer to this about some of the work that's being done on how algorithms can learn about the preferences and goals of humans. So to begin, Stuart Russell's group at Berkeley, this is an AI lab, has had this nice innovation of thinking the sort of ideal AI, and this is really for AIs at scales in intelligence, it becomes much more intelligent, should not be trying to, you shouldn't be trying to program in its utility function, or give it a set of goals. Rather, you should build in a model where the AI is sufficiently rational, and its goal is to learn your utility function. And in learning someone else's utility function, you should always be a little bit uncertain. And so this subtle change in how you think about how we encode values and goals in a machine, from writing it literally in ourselves, priority 1, do not hurt humans, priority 2, follow the orders of humans, or something more elaborate, to 2, training it based on a reward signal, which is what we're doing today, and then to Russell's perspective, 3, which is to ultimately build in a model of human behavior, cognition, and values, and then have it try to learn from its sort of owner, as it were. So this is a really interesting field of research that has relevance for both the long term and the near term, when you start having domestic robots and you want the machine to learn how you want your sandwiches prepared and so forth. There's some other nice work coming out of OpenAI and DeepMind that's called learning from human preferences. And basically what this involves is you have human subjects that are asked to basically instruct the machine, the algorithm, to perform some kind of task. So one example, and you can Google this, you get these great videos, is of a worm that's being trained to do a backflip. Now, it turns out it's really hard to program a worm to do a backflip, to specify what that means. But if you just get cheap labor, MTurkers from Amazon Mechanical Turk, and say, given any 2 frames of this worm flailing about, click on the one that looks most like a backflip. After several hundred of those instances of feedback, the worm learns to do a backflip. And you have all kinds of instances of this, where a human concept, which is sort of messy and hard to define, can be taught to a machine through this kind of conversation. So I think continuing research in this domain will be very powerful.
Okay, Paul, finally.
So while you gave a brief technical answer, I gave a brief non-technical answer, which is we need to make certain, this is again saying that we need to make certain there are lots of different people involved. And looking at instances of ethical disaster or near ethical disaster, one of the things which is often saved the day is somebody from outside stepping in and saying, what on earth are you lot doing? So one of the recommendations from social psychologists who've looked at how people end up doing bad things, because not so many people start off that way, one of the recommendations is that make certain that you've got different spheres of value, different social groups that you belong to, so different ways of looking at it. So a lot of the things that are going to be happening problematic in AI concern issues about how AI is used, those are the issues about programming ethical values into AI, which of course are important, but we also need to think about how AI is used, what's it displacing, for example, what things might you be missing, and it's a fresh pair of eyes or a fresh million pairs of eyes that are going to help alert researchers and people developing AI to see those sorts of things.
Saying a wider stakeholder group then,
Yes.
of people with different
Yes.
interests
Yes.
to comment and to be part of that design and
Yes,
development process.
precisely, yes.
Okay. Yeah, great. So now I'll open it out again to the audience. Do we have any questions? Yes. We've got a microphone there for you.
Hello. On the subject of responsibility, there have been occasional discussions of should the coders be responsible, should the people who gather data be responsible if you're building some machine learning style network. But we've been building complicated tools for a while now. Why is artificial intelligence different to previous tools, such as a scalpel? If it causes harm, then we attribute the blame to the person wielding the scalpel, not the person who built the scalpel. Why is AI different, and in what ways is it different?
Great. Okay, so what's different about AI? Why should we care more about AI than about the doctor's scalpel in terms of responsibility?
No, I don't want to go first. So
Okay.
I can go first.
Let's have
right?
Alan first, yeah.
Okay, well, I will not give Maria Rosaria's or part of the answer that I anticipate she has for it, so I'll focus on
So
Which-
you can go AI and reading mind?
a little bit, yeah. So, I mean, it's useful to both think how AI is similar to other technologies and problems and distinct. So, okay, so on the distinction dimension, autonomy and capability, the autonomy would be what I anticipate my co-panelists will talk about, adds new dimensions. But it's also, again, useful to think about how it's similar. So we do have solutions, institutional solutions, that we can draw from. And everything from responsibility in war, if a soldier takes an action on the front, who's responsible? That is sort of unethical or immoral. Who's responsible for that? Is it the soldier? Is it the local officer? Is it the higher up general? And these codes of sort of attribution of responsibility evolve depending on understanding of sort of what's realistic and perhaps our notions of ethics and morality. So I think my answer is there are lessons to be drawn from existing law and ethics.
Paula?
Well, yeah, I think there are different things you would say in. I think there are different things you would say in different cases. One of the elements of responsibility is who you're responsible to, and that in ethics we often feel as if people need to be able to explain why they've done something, or explain or be accountable to other people. So those elements of AI which might not be transparent, or it might not be able to explain exactly how they came to the decision, is going to cause questions in different cases. But I do think it's something where we need to look at a case-by-case basis. So that if, for example, if I could use the case of law, in law we've got worked out over centuries, we've got ideas about who's responsible, who's accountable, who deserves an explanation. So that's one of the reasons why people are very uneasy about, for example, in the States where they used algorithms to decide sentencing. But if we look at the case of law, it's really quite interesting because in the jury system, supposing you're thinking about whether or not you might be able to, whether we trust a machine to make a decision. Supposing we could develop a machine that would make a really accurate decision about whether somebody was guilty or not. Well, it's going to be really difficult, or at all not straightforward, to say we should replace juries with this machine. Because developed over centuries, we've got this really strong ethical ideal that we should be tried by a jury of our peers. And so, for example, one of the reasons why we want to hold on to that is precisely because of notions of legal change. So there have been some really important cases where juries have simply refused to convict, where it might be crystal clear that the person is technically guilty, but they've simply refused to convict. And those have often been really important cases of the development of law. But also juries are really, really interesting because they're black boxes. So that juries are not allowed to discuss their proceedings with anybody under penalty of going to prison. There are all sorts of safeguards around doing this. And even in this country, you can't ever discuss it with anybody afterwards. So in the States you can, which I think is so ingrained that you aren't allowed to do that when you read in the States of juries coming out and selling their stories, but that also illustrates how differently these are in different countries, even the countries which are fairly similar to us. So the question about responsibility is going to be different in different fields, but really importantly nested in quite strong values that we can't simply jettison. We can't just say, OK, AI is better than juries, let's get rid of jury trials.
Thank you. And Maria Rosari.
I'll go back to some kind of philosophy, try to see if I can surprise Alan here. So, moral responsibility, before AI or artificial agents came up, hinged on three things which were put together. There was agency, so ability to do things autonomously, culpability, so being causally linked to something, and then the ability of understanding the blame of the price that you will give someone as a consequence of their action. AI, or the digital, to use a sentence from Luciano Floridi, decouples these elements, so it divides them. So now we have agency with culpability, but we don't have responsibility, because AI doesn't understand. You unplug your computer, it's not a punishment to the computer. Or you yell at it, I tried a lot, but it doesn't seem to. Even if you price it, doesn't matter. So is this reason why we need to understand or come up with a new framework for moral responsibilities? Because all of a sudden we are deploying systems which are hybrids. We have human beings and artificial agents. And part of the systems performs actions which have a moral value. So an artificial agent can discriminate, can do harm, can do good. But we cannot ascribe the same kind of moral responsibilities. So the question emerges as to, well, then what kind of moral responsibility? How do we ascribe responsibilities? Which is important, because when you ascribe responsibility, then you can steer the system toward one way or the other. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you. So I'm afraid the time's run out. We've raised a lot of issues and challenges, I think, some that we've agreed on, some that we have different perspectives on. And I'd like to thank you all for your participation. Thank you for attending, thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. And thank you very much to our panel members, Paula Boddington, Alan Defoe, and Mario Rosario Tadeo. I hope we've given you some more food for thought. And should you want to keep up with what's happening at AI at Oxford, keep looking at the AI Oxford hashtag on Twitter. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.